where we left it yesterday, or shall we say where we started yesterday, was the beginning of the ISLM model, and we ended basically having completed the ISLM model, and we were going to start using it to look at a couple of examples. What I want to do is just quickly look at the diagram that we were drawing yesterday. Something going on here. Hang on. Okay, so we're drawing a whole bunch of diagrams yesterday. We started off with the aggregate expenditure model. We showed that there is a relationship between equilibrium interest rate as well as equilibrium level of output in the aggregate expenditure model. And the relationship between the interest rates and the level of output is an inverse relationship. Right? In other words, if we lower the interest rate, if we start at some interest rate R1 and we lower the interest rate to R2, we increase aggregate expenditure, and equilibrium in our model increases in terms of output as well as expenditure. So we move from our initial equilibrium point to a new equilibrium point at a higher level of output. So if we then plot the relationship between the interest rate and the level of output, we have an inverse relationship, and we call it the IS curve. And remember, IS stands for all the points where planned investment expenditure equals savings. Right? That's what the IS stands for. So we have an inverse relationship between interest rates and output in our aggregate expenditure goods market. We then looked at the relationship between interest rates and output in the money market. Now, the money market plots interest rates against quantity of money, and with a vertical money supply curve and a downward sloping money demand curve, we know that any given level of money demand, in other words, any specific money demand relationship, is dependent in part by the amount of goods and services that we want to buy. Okay? So part of our money demand is an asset demand. Part of our money demand is a transactions demand. In other words, we want to hold the money to buy goods and services. So if the number of goods and services that we want to buy or sell, transact with generally increases, okay? The number of transactions increases because the number of goods and services that we are producing and selling and buying increases. So we have an increase in output from Y0 to Y1. We will have a shift in our money demand curve. Our money demand curve increases. Our money demand curve shifts from the original MDY0 to the new MDY1. We have a rightward shift in money demand. Okay, so now if we want to see what is the relationship between output and interest rate given our money market situation, well, when output increases, what happens to equilibrium interest rates? It also increases. Therefore, we have a positive relationship. So if we plot the relationship between interest rate and output based on equilibrium in our money market, we have a positive relationship. We have an upward sloping curve, and we call this curve the LM curve. And LM stands for liquidity equal to money. So liquidity, remember, liquidity being demand for money, equal to money supply. So LM curve, upward sloping LM. And then, of course, we can combine our IS curve, which is plotted in the RY space, with our LM curve also plotted in the RY space, and we end up with an ISLM model. Right? Now remember, the IS curve gives us all the points of equilibrium in the goods market. The LM curve gives us all the points of equilibrium in the money market. So at the point where the IS curve and the LM curve cross, at that one point there, we are at a point on the IS curve and we are at a point on the LM curve, which means IS is an equilibrium, the goods market is in equilibrium and the money market is in equilibrium. So at this point of intersection, we have equilibrium in both those markets, which is pretty cool. You've got a whole lot of information all summarized in one diagram here. Okay? We then said, well, what about if we had a point like point D? Point D is on our LM curve, but it's not on the IS curve. Is our economy in equilibrium at point D? That's right. We said, no, it's not in equilibrium. And the problem is not with the money market. The problem is with the goods market. Because we're not on the IS curve, we're not at a point of equilibrium in the goods market. So the question I asked you was, where is point D in my goods market aggregate expenditure diagram? Where could I plot point D? And we came back to our initial aggregate expenditure diagram. We said point D corresponds to a point off equilibrium. And the thing about point D, if it's not in equilibrium in the aggregate expenditure model, that's a signal to firms to do something. Point D. At point D, for instance, there's a signal for firms to produce more, correct. Why? Because the level of expenditure is greater than the level of production, okay, or level of income. We're spending more than we are earning or producing. So firms start employing more people, they start producing more goods and services, and we move from point D back towards equilibrium. So what happens in our ISLM diagram, we see if we start at a point like point D, we know we're not at equilibrium in our IS market, in our aggregate expenditure market. So what should happen? Firms start producing more. As firms start producing more, what happens in our money market? Well, with an increase in output comes an increase in money demand, right? And as our money demand curve shifts, what happens to the interest rate? Interest rate increases. So as firms start producing more, we start moving up along our LM curve to the right. But of course, as the interest rate starts increasing, what happens in our aggregate expenditure model? As interest rates go up, what happens to investment spending? Goes down. So what happens in my aggregate expenditure model is my aggregate expenditure curve starts shifting downwards. And a movement down in my aggregate expenditure diagram is a movement to the left along my IS curve. So as firms start producing more, interest rates start increasing, and we start producing more. We move up along the LM curve, and on our IS curve, we're moving to the left, and eventually we will end up at a new equilibrium point E. Okay? So we said, right, let's see how that would look if we had an ISLM curve initially at equilibrium point A. We then shifted our IS curve. So with a shift in our IS curve, we now have a level of expenditure, given our initial equilibrium point. We have some level of expenditure now that's much greater than the amount that we're producing. Here's what we were producing. Here's what we now want to spend. Okay? We have a problem. We're not in equilibrium. We move from point A to point B. How do we move from point A to point B? Firms start producing more. As firms start producing more, interest rates start increasing. Increase in interest rates moves us back along the left, along our IS curve, and upwards to the right along our LM curve. We get to our new equilibrium point B. Okay, we're all on board, right? Any questions at this stage? Anything you want clarity on? Okay. So that was a brief recap of what we did. Now we're going to do some new stuff. Still going to be dealing with the ISLM. We're going to play around with it a little bit. We're just going to introduce some new examples. Okay. So an example that looks very similar to what we've done already, if we go back to our slides. Okay, so here's our equilibrium in our ISLM. what happens when we have a fiscal policy action. Okay? In other words, let's look at an expansionary fiscal policy. Okay, so we're first going to look at expansionary fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy would be, for example, what? What is an example of an expansionary fiscal policy action? So you have to shout it out a little bit. Infrastructure investment through the government. Okay, and how would they fund it? By increasing government spending. Okay? So an increase in government spending on, for example, infrastructure if we wanted, right? So an increase in government spending, an increase in G. So we said our aggregate expenditure, remember, is made up of a whole bunch of different components of expenditure. One of them is government spending. So when we increase government spending, we are changing our aggregate expenditure. When we change our aggregate expenditure, we shift the IS curve. Yes? Okay. So an increase in government spending will shift my IS curve to the right. And we saw in our example already what happens when you shift the IS curve to the right. What is the outcome in the economy? Interest rates increase and output increases. So then we ask the question, if you have an increase in interest rates and an increase in output, is an expansionary fiscal policy action good for our economy? And then yesterday, we basically had my teaching of economics before yesterday and then yesterday, right? Where someone answered, well, hang on a minute. If the interest rates go up, that means it has an effect on investment spending. So even though we maybe have an increase in output now in the short run, if it decreases investment spending, right, that slows down the growth rate of capital. So our long run growth rate slows down. And then, yeah, maybe I didn't express just how happy I was at that brief moment of time. It was like, lights shone through the clouds, the gloomy clouds of Ecos 1, and it was like, magical music was playing and stuff. Right? Cheers. And it was the most amazing answer. And it's absolutely correct. So we said, yes, it's great that we have an increase in output, but this increase in interest rates is a little bit problematic because it can crowd out, that was the terminology we used, crowd out investment. So what matters in this instance is what the government is spending on. If the government is using that money to pay salaries, for example, that's a problem. Because now we're sacrificing investment for current expenditure. That's not a good way to grow an economy. If on the other hand, the government is using that money to build infrastructure, right? It's increasing its spending to build infrastructure. Okay, well then we're crowding out some private investment for some public investment. That's potentially a good thing. If that public investment can get us better returns than what the private investment would get us. Okay? Then we're looking at something good. But the interesting story, if we compare that result to what we saw initially, in our original aggregate expenditure model, an increase in government spending increases aggregate expenditure, an increase in aggregate expenditure increases output. That's good, right? So the initial story was government spends, that's good, leads to growth. Once we take the money market into account, hang on a minute, the story changes a little bit. Now if government increases spending, yes, we do get an increase in output in the short run, but it has long run or potential long run implications. So our story's got a little bit more complicated. And don't worry, the story's going to get even more complicated once we add the aggregate supply side of things to everything. Remember, our ISLM model combines our aggregate expenditure model with our money market. What have we not yet combined that we have spoken about? Labor market. Labor market and production, remember that? We haven't got that anywhere in this diagram yet. We're going to get there. And we're going to add all of those together, and then that's going to be our ASAD model. Our aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. And then when... Sorry? What? Oh, okay. Then when we get to the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, and we look at what happens when we increase government spending, we're going to see that there's not only an effect in the goods market and in the money market, but also an effect in the labor market and on production. Okay? And then we'll evaluate once again how the government should be spending its money. Okay? Or whether the government should be spending any money. Okay, so that was our fiscal policy action, an increase in IS, and that was an expansionary fiscal policy. So let's take a quick 5 minutes for you guys. Get out a piece of paper and a pen. Okay, you guys ready? So we spoke about an expansionary fiscal policy. What happened when there was an expansionary fiscal policy? Interest rates increased and GDP increased. Expansionary. What I want you to think about now is, what about an increase in taxes? Is an increase in taxes an expansionary fiscal policy? No? What do we call it? Increase in taxes. Do you recall? No? Okay, an increase in taxes is called a contractionary fiscal policy. Have we not used that terminology yet? Not really. Okay. We'll come back to it in a moment then. For now, what I want you to do is use the ISLM diagram. Okay, so draw an ISLM diagram and use your ISLM diagram to illustrate what happens if government increases taxes. Remember, where does taxes come into this story? Taxes comes in consumption. A plus B times Y minus T. So an increase in taxes. What's going to happen in my ISLM diagram with an increase in taxes? So you guys can discuss that and quickly draw that. Okay, sorry. Are you happy that? Sorry, we're going to carry on. We are continuing. Are you happy that an increase in taxes, okay, sorry, let me take that away. An increase in taxes here leads to a decrease in consumption. Yes? So a decrease in consumption, what does that do to aggregate expenditure? That's right, it would be a decrease in aggregate expenditure. So a decrease in aggregate expenditure, what's that going to do to my IS curve? It's going to shift my IS curve to the left. Okay, so a shift in IS to the right, this was an increase in government spending. A shift in IS to the left, this is from an increase in taxes. So when the IS curve shifts to the left, what happens to my equilibrium interest rate? It decreases. What happens to my equilibrium level of output? It decreases. Right, you got that. So based on just this diagram, and again, remember, things are going to get more complicated, but just based on this diagram, government decides they want to raise revenue, so they increase taxes. Is that good for economic growth? Well, what does it do to output in the short run? Decreases output in the short run. But what does it do to the interest rate? It decreases the interest rate. So what does that do to investment spending? Maybe there's a long run bonus there, you know. Okay. A little bit of food for thought, maybe. Okay? Anyway, why do we call expansionary fiscal policy expansionary? In other words, why do we use the word expansionary? Because it expands output. An increase in government spending leads to higher output. That's an expansionary fiscal policy. It leads to more aggregate expenditure, which leads to more output. That's why it's called expansionary fiscal policy. So why would we call an increase in taxes contractionary fiscal policy? It's contractionary because aggregate expenditure decreases, right? It's contractionary because GDP decreases. It has a contractionary effect on the economy. It lowers production. It lowers output. An increase in taxes is contractionary. An increase in government spending is expansionary. What about a decrease in government spending? Would that be expansionary or contractionary? Okay, I think you've got it. So that was fiscal policy using our ISLM diagram to analyze government intervention in the economy. But all we've looked at is fiscal policy stuff. We can also use our ISLM diagram to look at monetary policy. In order to better illustrate what's going on here, though, I want to go back a couple of slides and get you on board with me about how this is happening. Remember how we derived the LM curve. When we derived the LM curve, our money supply was constant and we changed the level of output. When we changed the level of output, we had different money demand curves. And as we changed the level of output, we shifted the money demand curve. As we shifted the money demand curve, so our equilibrium interest rate changed. That was how we derived the LM curve. Yes. So here's my LM relationship. Here's point D. Here's point E, corresponding. Here's point F and the corresponding point. Okay. What if my money supply was in a... Sorry, yes. If the government decreases taxes, would that be expansionary? And your answer would be? You think so? You are correct. Yeah. Okay. So, back to our monetary policy side of stuff. What if our money supply curve was in a different place? In other words, let's say, what if our money supply curve shifted to the right, like this? Okay. Now remember, for our initial level of output, 1,100, we have our money demand curve MD0. So this is the one for 1,100, right? Where does our money demand curve intersect our money supply curve? Are you happy that it's at a point that I can't draw because it's going to keep selecting those two lines? Right? Are you happy that's the point of intersection? Right? So for this level of output, is my equilibrium interest rate, right, still going to be 4% with this new money supply curve? No. My interest rate is now, it's lower, right? You happy with that? Okay, what about our level of output here, 1,300? For 1,300, with my new money supply curve and my money demand curve, which corresponds to 1,300. So this was my money demand curve for 1,300. Okay. My new point of equilibrium, my point of equilibrium for 1,300 is now, are you happy it's here? Which is now a different interest rate to previously. This was my previous point of equilibrium. This is my new point of equilibrium. My new point of equilibrium is at a much lower interest rate. So let's see where that where that interest rate would be. Say here. Happy with that? And for my 1,500 level of output, I've got some money demand curve that corresponds to 1,500 output. You happy it's a new lower interest rate? That lower interest rate here somewhere. If I connect all these points, right? Are you happy that the position of my LM curve depends on the position of my MS curve, my money supply curve? So if I shift my money supply curve right or left, are you happy that that would shift my LM curve right or left? If I shift my money supply curve to the right, which way does my LM curve go? To the right. If I shift my money supply curve to the left, my LM curve would go to the left. Now, what could possibly shift my money supply curve? Any suggestions? What could shift my money supply curve? Yeah? Yes? You got more? I'm listening. Okay, so you're referring to three tools of the central bank, the South African Reserve Bank. There's three tools that the Reserve Bank can use to change money supply. Absolutely. What are those three tools? Money market, open market operations, adjusting the repo rate, and changing the required reserve ratio. Absolutely. Any of those three things will change the money supply. And all of those three things are called monetary policy actions. Any change in those three things is a monetary policy action. So all of those are tools of monetary policy. Okay, so now that we've hopefully you're on board with me on that. And now let's go talk about monetary policy. If I shift my LM curve to the right, like this diagram is showing me, what could the Reserve Bank have done to shift the LM curve to the right like that? What could they have done? So, do you want to chat about it quickly, or? Okay, you mean like amongst yourselves you want to chat about it? Are we happy that we know? What could the Reserve Bank do? Let me guide you here. What could the Reserve Bank do to the repo rate? Could decrease the repo rate. What could it do to required reserves? Could decrease the required reserves. What could it do in open market operations? It could buy securities. Remember, when the Reserve Bank purchases securities, it gives money to the people that are selling the securities to the Reserve Bank. So the Reserve Bank puts money into the economy and holds the securities, the bonds. So when the Reserve Bank buys securities, money gets injected into the economy. When money is injected into the economy, then the money supply is increasing. Okay. When the money supply increases, what's happening to my LM curve? It is shifting to the right. Okay. So when we have monetary policy that shifts the LM curve to the right, what happens to the interest rate? The interest rate decreases. What happens to our level of GDP? Our level of GDP increases. Do you think this is called expansionary monetary policy or contractionary monetary policy? It is called expansionary monetary policy. Okay? So the central bank, the Reserve Bank, increases money supply. That is called expansionary monetary policy. Why? Well, it increases output. It leads to economic growth. Well, short term, maybe long term. We'll talk about that now. Let's see. You have an expansionary monetary policy. In the short run, cool, you've got more GDP, you're producing more. What's happening to our interest rates? It's going down. What does that mean for investment? Increasing investment. What does that mean potentially for longer term growth? Seems like maybe that's a good thing. Yeah? So if you had an option between expansionary fiscal policy or expansionary monetary policy, which one seems to be better for growth? Okay, the monetary policy, sure, there's one difference. When the Reserve Bank increases the money supply, right, and the GDP increases because spending is increasing, and interest rates are going down and investment spending is increasing, all of that is private sector driven. You get what I mean? That's not government spending, right? So this is all private sector growth. So if part of your economic growth strategy involves, let's say, helping or promoting things that wouldn't normally be provided by the private sector, then you're not necessarily servicing that. You're not promoting growth through promoting those activities, if you get what I'm saying. Am I making sense? Okay. Let's say we need a road built between Joburg and Durban, right? The government could build a road. The private sector could build a road, right? Let's say private sector's not necessarily prepared to build that road, okay? Is there any reason that they wouldn't be? Maybe not, right? Okay? Because Durban, Joburg, that's a pretty good route. You know you're going to have cars, you know you're going to have trucks traveling along it, right? So if you can toll that route, as the private sector, you could build that road and then get money from tolling. What happens if you can't toll that road? How is the private sector, would you make money off that road? Would you make money off building that road if you cannot toll the road, if you are the private sector? No. So it might be good to have the road there, good for the economy, but no one in the economy wants to build that road because they cannot make money out of it. There is someone that can make money out of it. The government, when it raises taxes from the growth that comes from that road, right? You put the road there, the economy grows, the government raises taxes because that road is there. Maybe the government's happy to put a road there. Okay? What about a road from, and now, you know, my city dwellingness comes to the fore, but some undeveloped rural area, right, to Joburg. There's no potential commerce right at this point in time. There's no point in tolling the road because no one really wants to use it. But maybe government has a growth strategy. We want to develop in that rural area. And part of development in that rural area means access to that rural area. So what we would like to do is build a road now to start a development process in that rural area. Right? Government builds that road. You get it? This expansionary monetary policy doesn't address that sort of economic development. You get what I'm saying? There's a difference between private incentives and the incentives of government. Right? Technically, the incentives of government should be aligned to those that vote them into power. What we are witnessing currently is that that's not the case, right? There's a distinct misalignment between what people on the ground would like to see happening and what is actually happening. But nevertheless, there should be some kind of, let's say, a route, a channel between what people want and what government then delivers for those people that are unable to deliver it through the market mechanism, right? Through the private delivery of goods and services. And so governments might then step in, okay? So that is the key difference then between saying an expansionary monetary policy versus an expansionary fiscal policy. Okay. Everyone happy with that discussion? Are you happy that if we had a contractionary monetary policy, the LM curve would shift to the left, output would decrease, interest rates would increase? Yeah? Cool. In that case, I'm going to have a quick discussion and then we'll have a break. No, screw that. Let's have a break, then we'll have a quick discussion, and you can do, I want you to do 2 examples, and then we'll basically be done with the ISLM model. Okay.